Good evening, and thank you for coming to what I know will be a really insightful lecture. I'm Tracy Breton, a journalist and journalism professor here at Brown in the English Department's nonfiction writing program. I'm thrilled John Eligon could join us tonight to talk about his current beat, covering the racial divide in America. John, 34, is a reporter for the New York Times based in Kansas City. He has written for the Times for the past 12 years. He started his journalism career covering sports, the courts, and politics. Born on the island of Trinidad and Tobago, John moved to the US as a young boy. He took journalism in middle school because he loved sports and dreamed about writing about them. He graduated from Northwestern University with degrees in journalism and German. After college, he went to work for a year at the Detroit Free Press and then was hired by the Times as a sports writer. After covering sports for 2 years, he was moved to the news desk. His work at the Times has taken him to South Africa to cover the death of Nelson Mandela and to Turin to cover the Winter Olympics. Eligon, a marathon runner, also reported on the Boston Marathon bombing just after finishing the race. Now, on his current beat, John tries to document the nuance of America's difficult battle with race and class, from the protest movement over police violence to the changing face of the country's cities and suburbs. Eligon broke the story of a bail bond scheme that left poor defendants unable to gain their freedom and authored a series that followed one Detroit neighborhood over the course of a year to document how it changed as the city worked to lift itself out of bankruptcy. He also helped to shepherd the Times' coverage of the shooting of Michael Brown in Ferguson and the various issues surrounding race and police community relations that resulted. Let's give John a big welcome.
Thank you, Tracy, and thank you, everyone. It's great that you're here with me. I see this is probably everyone who did not get tickets to Trevor Noah, so I hope I'm the next best thing for you. But yeah, as you all know by now, I cover race in America for the New York Times. And the thing is, when people ask me what I cover and what race entails, I really cringe, because as most of you know, it's a very hard topic to unpack, and it's a really very difficult thing to talk about. Is race about Black people? Is it about white people? Is it about Latinos, Asians? Is it a topic that now includes other marginalized communities, such as the LGBTQ community? Is it about socioeconomics? Is it about racism? Is it about oppression? Is it about discrimination? And where do all these things overlap? I don't know that I have all the answers to this. And in truth, I don't think anybody really has all the answers to this, because I think this is a topic that's ever evolving. I think 20 years from now, the conversation about race is almost certainly going to be different. But what I do know is that race is an unavoidable reality of everyday life. It plays into the reality of every single person in this country. Now, that doesn't mean that it's something that everyone is conscious of. Many people have the privilege of ignoring it or refusing to acknowledge. And many others, however, don't have that luxury. For them, it's something that fills every nook and cranny of their existence. Quite frankly, I think that race in America is a Rorschach test. In my time as a journalist, I've seen firsthand just how much of a minefield race can be. And I want to share some of those stories with you tonight in the hope that you will better understand where America is in this constant battle over this touchy subject. It's clearly a topic that people are uncomfortable discussing and confronting. So I hope that these stories will help move us all toward engagement. And I hope that it can help us see where the problems still lie and maybe even start venturing towards solutions. And for those who are still hesitant about delving into this touchy topic of race, I want to say this. When you truly come to appreciate and understand the hardships and injustices that countless people are forced to live, talking about it should be the easiest thing we do. And I think it's important for me to first tell you all a little bit about how I got to this point, working at the New York Times, based in Kansas City, covering race. A few weeks ago, I was on a TV show, New York Times Close-Up. I don't know if any of you all know it. It airs on New York 1. And the interviewer, he asked me, he goes, as a country, are we too consumed with race? And for me, there was kind of two levels of answers to this. There was one, it's a personal thing for me in terms of a journalist who covers race. And the other one is a more practical answer when you look at the experiences and stuff of people who have to live, some of these racial realities. Now, personally, I do have to admit that race can be pretty overwhelming for me. I remember talking to one of my good friends a couple years back. He's also a reporter, and he's also black. It was around the time of a lot of the protests over police killings of black people. And we were lounging around, and he was just like, man, I'm tired of the struggle. And it was true. We were sitting there, and it was just like every week, we're writing about one thing, and it always seems, there's something else to unpack and something else to figure out. And writing out, it really is an exhausting existence. And for me, I wonder as well if covering race has in some ways made me very cynical and almost analytical to the point of paranoia. I'll give you an example. Has anyone seen the movie Passengers with Jennifer Lawrence and Chris Pratt? One? Don't worry, you're not missing much. But I was lounging around at home one day with my wife, and we had access to a copy of the movie on our TV. And so it's this movie. They're on some spaceship that's going to some planet that's 90 years away, and they're all in this hyperbolic sleep or something like that. But Chris Pratt, his character, his chamber opens up early, like 80 years early, and he's the only one. And so eventually he wakes up Jennifer Lawrence, and intentionally because he was lonely and blah, 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 and they do things and whatnot. But the part that got me is that about halfway through the movie, Laurence Fishburne suddenly appears. And for those of you who don't know, Laurence Fishburne is a black actor. He's well known in many movies. The Matrix is one of them. And so he appears, and he was a part of the crew, so he better knew how to troubleshoot what the problems were in the ship. And so to make a long story short, he tells them things that they can do to fix the ship. And then suddenly, he comes down with a terminal illness, and he quickly dies. I was like, what the hell is this? Like, they brought a black man on for 15 minutes to show white people how to save themselves, and then he just dies off. I know Hollywood needs more non-white characters, especially ones who are not gangsters or slaves, but really? You bring him in to die? For me, I kept wondering, am I overthinking this? All I was seeing, is this image of a black man coming in and swooping in to help white people save the day, and then somehow he's just discarded. That really evoked some emotions in me. And again, I'm like thinking, am I really overthinking? Am I seeing color too much? And another example, just last week, I was at a fundraising banquet in Kansas City for an organization that helps mostly low-income children. Most of them are black. And most of the people attending the banquet were white. Now, the purpose of this event was to woo people to give money to the organization. So some of the children that the organization serves, they got up on stage, they did songs, they danced. Some of them made videos chronicling their lives. And one of those videos that they showed, it was really emotional. It was a young girl who talked about losing her young brother to gun violence, her older brother to gun violence. She talked about being scared in her neighborhood, about what it's like to go outside and not wanting to go outside sometimes because she's too scared. It was definitely the type of story that puts a real lump in your throat. But somehow, through this really emotional, heartfelt story, all I could think was, is this some type of performance art for white people? I know, I'm wondering what is wrong with me, really. Because, here are these folks who are here, they're well-intentioned people. Many of them have big pocketbooks, and they want to contribute toward making a difference in these kids' lives. But here I was absorbing the moments through the prism of race. In my mind, what I saw was the video seemed like something of an exploitation of black suffering. Sure, it tugged at heartstrings. Sure, it seduced some people to shell out thousands of dollars. But would these same people actually ever spend time in the communities where these young people live? Would they patronize the businesses there? Would they build their own homes there? Or would they send their children to school there? What would they think of one of these children when they become a teenager and they're walking toward them on the street? Would they move to the other side? Would they clutch their purses? Would they hire these kids once they grew to be working age and trust that they could work just as hard and well as their own white children? I know, I'm super cynical. And maybe it's partially just being a journalist. Maybe it's the things I've seen. But the important thing here is that the prism of race is real. Race is a real thing in this country. And just as someone who covers it, I see it everywhere I go. But the reality for me is that exploring every aspect of race isn't just a job, it's my life. I'll give you a little bit of background about me. as Tracy mentioned, I was born on the beautiful island nation of Trinidad and Tobago. Growing up there, race was actually a very different experience for me. Just about everyone in Trinidad is a person of color. And I guess you'd say most people were of African descent in Trinidad, but it was also a very mixed place. Our history of racial discrimination is very different from the history of racial discrimination is here. It's not really as deeply rooted in the present there the way it is in the United States. And technically, by Trinidadian standards, I'm what you would call Indian and Negro. And yes, we do say Negro there. I have family members who are part white. I have some who are very Indian. And I never grew up with this sense of race in my life. I never kind of grew up thinking about, what color am I? In fact, we moved to the United States when I was 6 years old. And I distinctly remember having that moment sometime when I was young when I was like, I'm black? Like, I literally didn't know it. I didn't even think about it. Like many immigrants from the Caribbean, my parents were very conservative when it came to issues of race. They were not shaped by the trauma that afflicted black Americans. So in many ways, racism here did not resonate with them. At least they never talked to me about it. Those conversations that many black Americans have with their children about how to interact with police, we never had those in my household. I never got the sense that my parents quite understood the cycle of poverty that a lot of black families in America get sucked into. This is not to say that my parents were colorblind in their existence. I do remember one time when a police officer pulled over my dad while I was in the car with him, and afterward he told me that he was almost certain that he got pulled over because he was black. Still, they never allowed me to linger on race or give me any impression that my race or background would be an impediment to anything I wanted to do. All they impressed upon me was to work my butt off. We moved into communities that were predominantly white, but again, race wasn't talked about in our household. So as a youngster, I didn't even really notice that I was different. That changed as I grew older, however. It seemed no coincidence to me that in middle school, I was one of very few people who was jumping up and cheering when O.J. Simpson was found not guilty. There were times when I sensed that classmates would make racially insensitive remarks, but I was only one of 4 black people in my high school graduating class, so I didn't really have anyone to back me up. I couldn't really be bold in my blackness. And then I went to college. I don't think it was by accident that in my first year at Northwestern, all the black freshmen in my dorm, we were all placed on the same floor. Almost all of us were on the same floor. I was invited to a lot of black social events, black parties, black clubs. It became something of a black paradise for me, actually. At the time, only about 5% of Northwestern's undergrads were black. And I remember saying, man, there's so many black people here. But then there was a black friend I had from the south side of Chicago. He was like, where are all the black people at? And clearly we were coming from 2 different perspectives. In my high school, pretty much all of my friends were white because there were so few black folks. In college, all of my friends were suddenly black. What I'm about to say next is something that I'm sure plenty of black students who grew up in mostly white communities can relate to. I became super pro-black. Suddenly there was all this culture in black education that I felt I had been missing out on. A history lecturer my freshman year, he delivered a line that I'm never going to forget. He said, Lincoln didn't free the slaves freed themselves. I was like, damn it, they lied to me in high school. To be clear, I had always felt this innate sense of loyalty to my African heritage. I embraced being different growing up and loved proving that I could stand out, even when people didn't expect much of me. But in many ways, my embrace of race and what it meant to be black was learned. In a recent article about President Obama, Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote that the former president, having been raised by white people, did not come from the typical black experience. Instead, President Obama's blackness was something that he had to connect with, that he had to embrace. Now, I'm not saying that I'm like President Obama by any stretch of the imagination. My speaking fees would be much higher if I were. But I see very similar experiences between his life and mine. As a boy, my racial identity was not necessarily drilled into me, but I learned it. I came to appreciate it strongly over time. You could argue that I've come to embrace my racial identity so much that I can't even let a simple charity event go by without parsing its racial implications. But I've also developed a shrewd eye for finding stories that show us how race still resonates today. Before I officially got the beat covering race for the New York Times, the topic played very heavily into many of the stories that I wrote. When I was a sports reporter, I got to cover the Winter Olympics in Turin. One of the events that I had to cover was bobsled. And I became curious when I learned that the few black bobsledders that there were, they served as pushers. Does anyone here know anything about bobsledding by chance? Or So you got the pushers, and then you got the driver in the front, right? I was hoping like no one knew anything about it, so I hope I'm not getting anything wrong here. But basically what I learned was that the pusher was like the power position. Like Herschel Walker, the big former football player, he was a pusher. And the driver was considered the one who had to be tactful, to have the smarts, the skills to do things. And there were several black bobsledders who were actually working to become drivers. They wanted to be in the driver's seat. And that really reminded me of the struggle that black quarterbacks had in the National Football League for many years. For years, racist NFL executives had seen them as lacking the mental capabilities to run an offense. It took time and a lot of effort to disprove that nonsense. And I wondered if the same thing was going on in bobsledding. So I wrote a story about that. And from there, I went on to cover the courthouse in Manhattan. One of the first stories that struck me was that of a young Latino man who was arrested for drug violations. He kept getting arrested over and over for drug possession, cocaine, selling, and whatnot. And the judge was anguishing over what to do with the man, whose name was Yiskar, after he had been arrested for the third time in a short period. The judge decided to give Yiskar one final chance, saying that if he stayed out of trouble, he would not get serious prison time. Lo and behold, Yiskar got arrested again, not long after that, and the judge had to sentence him to prison. I remember when I expressed fascination in the case, another reporter covering the courthouse was like, "Why the biggest interest in this case?" To her, it was just another young man of color churning through the criminal justice system. But that was exactly what drew me in. I wanted to know exactly what it was that prevented young people like Yiskar from staying clear of trouble. So I went to the jail to interview Yiskar. He came from a working-class Dominican family and actually had a lot of support growing up. But the glow of fast money and selling drugs was too much for him to refuse. He got caught up in a game that he couldn't get out of. What I found most powerful about the case is that it questioned the fervor with which the criminal justice system churns black and brown men in and out of jail. In at least this one instance, a judge seemed to take stock of that. Quote, "If I commit this defendant to state prison at this point, we've completely written him off, and it cannot possibly make him a productive member of society." That's what the judge said before he sentenced Yiskar. The judge could have given Yiskar about 9 years in prison, but after my article on Yiskar, the judge had received a flood of letters for leniency for the young man. One of them came from an inmate who the judge had sentenced to life in prison for murder. "Nothing that they say about rehabilitation in state prison is true," the inmate wrote to the judge. He then pleaded with the judge to, quote, "Please consider any other options than this human warehouse for Yiskar." Now, I hate to judge the impact of stories that they may or may not have had on a certain situation or a certain outcome. But in this case, Judge Farber clearly put a bit more thought into this decision. He ended up giving Yiskar only about 4.5 years in prison. For me, that was affirmation about how our attitudes can be impacted when we stop and listen to the stories of marginalized black and brown people. After several years of covering the courts, I did a stint covering government in New York State. During that time, I reported on the politics of identity in Harlem. Specifically, I looked at how long-serving Congressman Charles Rangel, a black man with a strong black voter base, had to navigate a district that was becoming majority Latino. He had to tread a fine line with his own Latino heritage. His father was Puerto Rican, but he hated his father. But Rangel still had to reluctantly embrace that Puerto Rican side. So he would occasionally spit out a phrase or two of broken Spanish. So following my time reporting on state government, I moved to Kansas City to become a national correspondent for the Times. And in this point, I'm just covering a region. I'm covering 6 states in the Midwest. But I immediately began to pick up on themes of race. There was one instance that Google was rolling out this new high-speed internet service, and they completely botched the sign-up. The way they did the sign-up, it ended up that most of the neighborhoods most of the poor black neighborhoods in the city were passed over and would not be getting the service. Then there was also a fight over a school transfer program in St. Louis region that saw parents from predominantly white schools angrily yelling over the potential influx of students from failing majority black schools. It wasn't until that fateful day in August 2014 that the focus of my beat and the entire country shifted toward race. By now, we all know the story of Michael Brown getting fatally shot by a police officer in Ferguson, Missouri. His killing sparked months of protests and unrest, and it brought new scrutiny to law enforcement's treatment of black people. But Mike Brown certainly was not the first black man to be shot and killed by police. So why did his death draw so much renewed attention on police treatment of black and brown people? Well, the reasons are many and nuanced, but I do trace it, at least in part, back to a memorable incident that happened the night after the killing. Dozens of rioters set upon a Quick Trip gas station in Ferguson. They looted it and they burnt it down. Now I submit to you all that the Quick Trip had to burn. It had to burn down. Now by no means here am I advocating for vandalism as a problem-solving method, but I have to face reality here. The reason the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, Fox News, ABC, NBC, the reason all these national media outlets rushed to Ferguson was because it was burning. Remember that exploitation of black suffering that I talked about at the fundraiser in Kansas City? Well, this here was exploitation of black anger and pain. I will be the first to criticize the media. There had long been problems with police treatment of black people in the St. Louis region. In fact, my own family had experienced it there. But oftentimes, the root of the problem is not sexy or compelling enough for us to cover it. But now here we have a burning gas station, we have looters, we have some of the most sensational scenes that we had seen since the LA riots. So of course the media is going to rush there. And just for a bit of real talk here, yes, there were some rabble-rousers on the ground in Ferguson. It was summertime. There were young people who were out of school. There were huge gatherings on the main thoroughfare. Many people were there to protest, but also many people were just there to hang out and taunt the police. Some folks were just looking to have some fun. So some of them, they drank and they smoked. I'm sure it's not really different than what happens here at Brown on a weekend. Except here, students have cozy dorms or apartments to go back to. There, life is a little bit more complicated. The truly skilled reporters in Ferguson were able to dig in and find that deeper story. So while the burning buildings and the broken windows brought reporters there, we had to find what was truly happening. And what was found was that a systemic law enforcement regime that had used ticket fines to pad the municipal coffers, not to keep the community safe. We saw people being thrown in jail essentially for being poor. And what did the victims of these tactics have in common? They were mostly black. In his autobiography, Nelson Mandela writes about a meeting that he had with reporters after he got out of prison. They grilled him on his stance on peace and nonviolence. But he writes, quote, "It was the reality that the threat of the armed struggle that had brought the government to the verge of negotiation, it was the reality and the threat of the armed struggle that had brought the government to the verge of negotiations." I would argue that the fiery unrest in the early days of Ferguson not only captured the attention of the news media, but it also got the government to take notice. This was the start of a new civil rights movement in America, the Black Lives Matter movement as we've come to know it. It started with efforts to right the criminal justice system that disproportionately targets black and brown people. But then the agenda expanded to include more things: segregated schools and housing, investment in black communities and businesses, political power. My editors asked me to devote my job to reporting on America's renewed racial reckoning. It quickly became clear that this new movement deeply divided the nation. It strained friends and family bonds. It's created for uncomfortable holiday discussions over dinner. To put it bluntly, it forced people to pick a team. I heard this from Ashley Bernal. She's a white woman from Indiana who is married to a black man. Ashley told me that her white family had always been smitten with her husband. But then after Mike Brown's killing, her family was more outraged over the demonstrations than the killing itself. They just couldn't seem to grasp how prevalent racial injustice was. Ashley was straddling two worlds. In one, her black mother-in-law was patting her on the back saying she was proud of her for speaking out against the killing. In the other, her white family and friends are telling her to quiet down because, quote, "you don't know the whole picture." Montague Simmons had spent his career as a union organizer. He's a black man, but he always stood alongside his white colleagues when fighting for union causes. That changed after Mike Brown's death. Montague went to protest at an election party for the St. Louis County executive. He was dismayed that the executives had an alliance with the prosecutor who was prosecuting the Mike Brown case. As Montague and other demonstrators took to the floor of the party to chant and to disrupt the event, he was shocked to see some of the people who were blocking them. They were the white union members. Montague told me that, quote, "in any other setting, any other fight over the last 2 or 3 years, we'd be shoulder to shoulder." When it comes to race, all of a sudden, that's not the case. But there are also white people who felt that they had lost friends because of these disputes over police treatment. Around the same time of the upheaval of the killing of Michael Brown, in Staten Island, a grand jury had cleared a New York City police officer who choked to death Eric Gardner, who was black. Peter Weiss, a white Staten Island resident, told one of my colleagues that shortly after news broke of the non-indictment of the officer, a black acquaintance approached him at the bar. This acquaintance was usually very friendly with him, but now he called Peter a redneck. Peter said he believed this was an example of people harping on the past to make assumptions about the present. He told us, quote, "Blacks and whites, we don't hate anymore. There is no real racism anymore for anything real, like who can get a job. Honestly, people are so stuck in the past, people need to grow up." Now, we should take a moment here to talk about racism. Does anyone know what the worst slur that you can call someone today is? Anyone want to venture a guess? That could be it. There we go, a racist. And I come to that conclusion after going to many places and writing about race. And time and again, that line comes up when I travel around the country and talk to people about race. I'm not a racist. The truth is, we can't talk about race without discussing racism. Reporting on race is essentially reporting on racism. The thing that makes this particularly difficult is that we've moved the goalposts when it comes to defining racism. As my colleague Greg Howard wrote for the New York Times Magazine, racism was originally defined as policies that disadvantage certain classes of people. That's basically what we call systemic racism today. But in 1964, Alabama's segregationist governor, George Wallace, sought to differentiate between a racist and a segregationist. He said, quote, "A racist is one who despises someone because of his color, and an Alabama segregationist is one who conscientiously believes that it is in the best interest of the Negro and the white to have a separate educational and social order." Just like that, racism was no longer about government policies that relegated minorities to the margins of society. It wasn't about Japanese internment camps. It wasn't about exclusionary immigration laws. It was not about segregated schools. It was about what was in a person's soul. Now that laws don't explicitly bar people from getting work, people like Peter from Staten Island can declare a post-racial paradise where racism no longer exists. You think I'm a racist? Prove it. To be a racist is now to have a wretched heart, to hate someone just for the way they look or where they come from. This definition is, of course, contrary to the reality of the racial experience in America today. And I would even argue that it's contrary to what the courts have said. For example, just 2 years ago, the Supreme Court ruled in a case out of Texas that if the government relegates affordable housing for poor families to predominantly minority communities, it could be breaking the law. That's because those who benefit from affordable housing are mostly people of color, and relegating them to minority communities will continue patterns of racial segregation. So even if there was no intent to harm people of color, if a policy has a negative discriminatory effect, it violates the Fair Housing Act. Unintentional Discriminations was at the heart of a piece that I wrote exploring the Flint water crisis. For those not familiar with the situation, several years ago, Michigan officials changed Flint's water source from a source in Detroit to the Flint River. The water was contaminated with dangerously high levels of lead. It took years before state and federal officials acknowledged the concerns of Flint residents. They finally stepped in to change the water supply, but by then, tens of thousands of residents had already been exposed to bad water. Flint is a majority black city. There's a high level of poverty. So the question was whether this was a case of racism. The term environmental racism refers to the relegation of racial minorities to communities with the greatest exposure to environmental hazards. Did it really matter whether or not the government officials responsible for taking care of Flint intended to poison the water? In this case, I would argue it didn't matter. What mattered is that the careless government actions exposed a majority black population to very dangerous water. Would this have happened if Flint were predominantly white? I guess that's something of an existential question. I'm sure most black people and other racial minorities can relate to this feeling of always wondering whether if something is happening because of your race. Is it because I'm black? Is it because I'm Latino? Is it because I'm Asian? But I posed this question to Michigan Governor Rick Snyder. I asked his spokesman, quote, "Did the racial and socioeconomic demographics of Flint play a role in how Governor Snyder addressed the concerns about the water quality in Flint when they first popped up in 2014?" I got a response from the spokesman via email. He said, quote, "Much of Governor Snyder's time in office has been focused on improving the quality of life for people living in our urban areas, especially Detroit. Bringing Detroit back to solid fiscal foundation has allowed the city to restore services and we've watched its economy grow, creating better jobs and opportunity." I never asked a question about Detroit. I could go on and read you the rest of the email. There were about 5 more paragraphs that rambled on about what the governor had done for Detroit and other urban communities. Not sure, I think they were making the point that they were trying to help black people, but I can only presume that because they never mentioned the word race in that email. It's like they just danced around and they talked around it. It certainly didn't mention Flint or make any attempt to answer my question. It just shows me that even in the highest levels of government, or may I say especially in the highest levels of government, race is an impossible thing to discuss. They just wouldn't touch it. The fact is that many of the problems surrounding race in this country were created by intentional government policy. So efforts to address them don't come easy when you have government officials and politicians who prefer the path of least resistance. Who wants to paint they want to paint a rosy picture of the communities so they can get reelected and collect checks from their big donors. I think it's fair to say that one of the greatest racial disparities created by the government is housing segregation. I won't bore you with all the history of redlining and home lending and real estate steering, but even though many of the legal tools enforcing segregation are gone, statistics show that much of the country remains racially segregated today. I submit to you that segregation persists for both structural and cultural reasons created by generations of forced segregation. Just as a quick aside, some might ask why racial segregation is even bad. Well, on a practical level, there are only a finite amount of resources in this country. And the fact is, separate has never been equal. So when you have marginalized groups pushed to certain pockets of a city, there you will often find disproportionate challenges, be it poverty, crime, under-resourced schools, poor healthcare. On the healthcare front, one thing that astonished me when I did some reporting in Chicago was that the areas where they have the highest crime, the South and the West Side, which are mostly Black and Latino, are also the areas where there are no medical trauma centers. So basically, you have gunshot wound victims who have to be driven across the city to the north side in order to get proper treatment. I met a young woman on the south side whose cousin died from a stab wound because the ambulance could not get him to a trauma center in time. Segregation can indeed have deadly consequences. But going back to the structural forces that perpetuate segregation, the fact is that for generations, Black people were denied home ownership. And when they did get a chance to own homes, they were often in the least desirable neighborhoods and they were the least desirable housing stock. They were in places that white people would abandon, which meant that a housing market centered on white preference would deem those homes less valuable. What's been left is a tremendous wealth gap between Black and white families. We ran some of the numbers at the Times, and the results were quite staggering. We compared Black families across the country earning at least $100,000 to white families earning at least $100,000. We found that only 22% of those Black families lived in what would be considered affluent areas. And 37% of them lived in high poverty communities. For white families, however, nearly half of them earning at least $100,000 lived in wealthy areas, while only 9% lived in poor communities. We wanted to examine this a little bit further. So I went to Milwaukee, where the disparities in segregation are particularly large. There I met the Spence Brookins family. Zantani and Letitia live with their 2 children, Zantani Jr. and Zaria. About a decade ago, Zantani and Letitia embarked on the American dream. They bought a house. That house ended up being in a neighborhood where 93% of the people were Black like them. It was a 2-bedroom home and it cost $98,000. The problem was they bought it in 2008, and anyone who has followed the housing market knows that that was a bad time to buy a home. It was right when the bubble across the country was bursting. Their home, like many others, plummeted in value. It dropped by about 75%. Data tells us that predominantly Black communities were hit harder by the housing crash than others. For the Spence Brookins family, this meant seeing the houses around theirs go abandoned. It meant the community deteriorating, and it meant crime increasing. One day, Zanzani Jr. was walking home from a Walmart with a Barbie doll that he had bought for his little sister for her birthday. A man approached him and said, quote, "Give me all your money or I'm going to bash your head in with this rock." As Zanzani Jr. recalled the incident to me, he said, quote, "I didn't know what to do." And what he said next really floored me. He said, quote, "This was my first time being robbed." I can't get over how remarkable that line is. This was my first time being robbed. We all assume we're going to achieve first, right? Have our first love, first job, first home, first kiss. But here was a young man with two hardworking parents earning a combined six-figure salary who approached a grim milestone with an air of inevitability. This was my first time being robbed. In segregated communities, it's a sad reality for too many people of color. Expectations that they will inevitably suffer harsh injustices. Eventually, Zanzani and Letitia had had enough of this deteriorated neighborhood, so they decided to move. But by then, because of this housing crisis and because of the inability of their neighbor to rebound, their house was worthless. An old cycle was repeating itself. This was another black family that had done everything they thought was right, earn college degrees, get married, get good jobs, but here they were finding themselves in a dead end when it came to building wealth. So Zanzani and Letitia just abandoned the house and moved to a suburb called Whitefish Bay. In Milwaukee, people jokingly call it White Folks Bay. It is 90% white. It sits on a bluff with beautiful vistas of Lake Michigan. There are large, classically styled homes, but without the wealth behind them, the best that Zanzani and Letitia could afford was a small rental bungalow. They paid $1,450 a month, or nearly two and a half times the monthly payments on the house they once owned. For the most part, they enjoyed their life there. They liked the walkability of the community. Stores and restaurants were nearby, so were parks. But then came an indoctrination that is all too familiar to black people. As Zanzani Sr. drove home one day, a police officer pulled him over. Zanzani had a plastic cover over his license plate. In his old neighborhood, it was necessary to have this cover so your license plate won't get stolen. But in this neighborhood, the officer told him, it's illegal. The officer let him go with a warning, but not before asking him where he lives. Zanzani told me that over the first month and a half that they lived in Whitefish Bay, he was pulled over about once a week. I was surprised at how nonchalant and even comedic he was about the whole thing. He called the frequent stops getting registered. In my mind, Zanzani's attitude was a reflection of a sad reality for black and other marginalized peoples. The expectation of injustice, the expectation that we will be subjected to some form of dehumanization. One of my first assignments in the Midwest for the New York Times was to go to Lincoln, Nebraska, to write about Deb Fisher, who had won a seat in the US Senate. Wearing a pink button-down shirt, jeans, and Prada dress shoes, I walked around the neighborhood she grew up in and knocked on doors to see if anyone knew her when she was growing up. I had finally found a family at the end of the cul-de-sac, and they were eager to talk to me and share memories of her. They even pulled out this high school yearbook, and we were flipping through it, looking at pictures and talking about her life. But as I was interviewing them, a couple of police cars rolled up. The officers hopped out and interrupted me mid-interview. Someone had called to report a suspicious person. I'm not gonna lie, I was pissed. I couldn't treat this with the same levity that Zanzani treated his police stops. A few months later in Paola, Kansas, I was again stopped by the police and asked for ID after someone called in the report of a suspicious person. My crime? I was walking around a campground interviewing people about why they were camping during a massive heat wave. Some people might be able to think of 1,000,001 excuses why the police had stopped me legitimately. I like to fancy myself as an open-minded person, but I'm sorry. In these cases, I know there was only one reason I was dubbed a suspicious person. It's because I'm a black man with dreadlocks. This segues into my other point about segregation, that it's cultural. Yes, there is a degree of choice when it comes to segregation today, but how can you blame people for wanting to choose communities where most people look like them when this country conditioned that outlook over many generations? How can I blame any black person for wanting to live in a mostly black community when living around mostly white people can get you dubbed as suspicious for simply doing your job? The Spence Brookins family eventually moved out of Whitefish Bay back to a predominantly black community on Milwaukee's north side, Part of it was by chance. They found a nice rental house. But the cultural impacts of living in Whitefish Bay were weighing on them, especially when Zantini and Letitia looked at their daughter, Zaria. She always wanted to straighten her hair. She once bawled when her hair got wet while she was in the bathtub because it became frizzy. Zaria's school friends called her their black friend. Her musical tastes gravitated toward Justin Bieber and Taylor Swift. Quote, "I thought she was getting lost," as Zantini told me. In many ways, that unwelcome feeling that black people experience in majority white communities is real. Studies have shown that while people of color generally prefer to live in mixed race neighborhoods, white people prefer neighborhoods where most people are white. It was only about 5 years ago when a major controversy broke out in another Milwaukee suburb, New Berlin, after the mayor supported a proposal to build a low-income housing project in the city. Residents flooded the city council meetings to complain. No one said the word black, but they all made it clear what upset them. People spoke of not wanting their town to become a ghetto like the north side of Milwaukee, the part of the city that is predominantly black. One person planted a sign in the mayor's yard that read, "Nigger lover." It's easy for us to dismiss people who express such blatantly racist views as fringe extremists. If you've ever been a black journalist, then your inbox will tell you that it's more than just fringe extremists who express these views. But let's assume for a second that it's just a very small element of America that is overtly racist. Let's put it at 1% of the country. That's more than 3 million people. That's 3 Rhode Islands. The point here is that a country where racial hostility still resonates deeply, people of color are left in an unenviable position. Try to get into a more integrated community and access all the resources that come with it at the risk of facing racial hostility, or find a way to make it in segregated, under-resourced communities. Indeed, mustering up courage to pursue the first option comes hard. My latest story that I'm working on right now looks at the controversy over efforts to build low-income apartment buildings in a wealthy white area of Houston. I asked Erica Ashton if she would want to live in the low-income apartments in that community if they got built. Erica is a 38-year-old black woman who currently lives in a subsidized apartment in a predominantly black community. No, she told me without hesitating, because I don't want anybody to treat me stupid because of the way you're stereotyping me. She added that she was concerned that her children would have to be uptight when they were outside playing, out of concern for what their white neighbors would think of them. This, to me, folks, speaks to the essence of segregation, of what segregation has done to us psychologically. Many of us are not comfortable stepping outside of our tightly defined racial boundaries. No matter what prize beckons on the other side, the stain of racial animus is just too much to ignore for people like Erica. Segregation, I believe, has broken the American psyche. But things are not irretrievable. As cynical as I might come off, I hope that I haven't come across as too hopeless. Yes, we have major problems of race to confront in this country, but we can find ways to make a difference. As I've said before, I don't have all the answers, but here are some things that I think could get us at least moving in the right direction. First, let's try to give credence to others' opinions. We can't be afraid to admit when someone else has a valid point, even when we don't agree with it. We have to understand that many people growing up in environments where they are not exposed to people of different races and cultures, and I don't think we should necessarily hold that against them. I know this isn't a super popular opinion, but it sometimes seems that we're in such a highly politicized era that it's all or nothing. You're either 100% with me or you're not. You either understand and embrace your white privilege or you're just an incorrigible racist. I don't think that's a healthy attitude. Now, I completely understand that you can't always expect a victim of oppression to try to educate the ignorant. I can relate. It's pretty tiring to have to be that lone black voice in school or at work who has to correct someone and speak up when they say something wrong. Sadly, we're still at the point where we do have to go that extra mile to speak out against ignorance. And we may even have to show an uncanny amount of patience when we find ignorance. There are still many people who don't understand when they cross the line into racism. I think it's important to help those people along, especially when they are open-minded and willing to learn. Second, let's try to walk in each other's shoes. One of the reasons that I became a journalist is because I wanted to explore other people's lives. I wanted to spend time with other people who I've never met, whose lives I've never seen, and experience what they experience. But let's just always be mindful of where other people are coming from. I remember once I was in line to go into a nightclub with a white friend from high school. We were in New York, and he was the only white person in the line. He looked at me and whispered at how awkward it was that he was the only white guy. I was a little bit flabbergasted. Did he not realize that when we were in high school, I was usually the only black person in the room? Or that I was the only black person at the parties at his house? But this is the ultimate mainstreaming of whiteness to me. I was expected to be comfortable in all white environments. It was assumed that I was going to be comfortable. But put him in an all black environment, and it's as if new rules apply. This is why it's very important that we try to understand and appreciate what it's like to live in someone else's shoes. Finally, I think it's important that we stop talking about race. Let's start being about race. Conversations are great. I'm glad you all came to hear me speak, and I hope that my words have been somewhat enlightening. But we have to start taking meaningful actions that will break down the country's many sturdy racial divides. It's great to go to a fundraiser for an organization that helps disadvantaged minority youth. But when we move into those hip, up-and-coming neighborhoods, how about we send our children to the same schools as the kids who have lived there their entire lives? Or when we look for candidates to fill jobs, let's proactively search outside of our peer groups for people who could bring new perspectives to those roles. The simple fact is, we are never going to get rid of race. That's not even what we should be trying to do. What we should strive for is to stop using race as a weapon and a wedge. The best way to do that is to confront our diverse world, bathe in it, embrace that which makes us different, and learn something from it. Thank you.
John, at the start of your talk, you said that the discussion about race will be different in 20 years. What did you mean by that?
Yeah, I thought about that question because I knew that question was going to come. And I meant the prism through which we look at race, right? So when I talk about now we look at things like intersectionality, we look at race not just as, kind of black, white, Latino, Asian, but we group marginalized communities together. And I think there's a real push now to look at marginalized communities as a whole, because you look at strength in numbers, you look at shared experiences, and you see how people support each other. And I'm not sure what that conversation is going to look like in 20 years, but I can imagine different things will come up that we don't imagine now. Like now the discussion, for instance, around immigration, which centers mostly when people talk about Latino issues, they often tend to talk about immigration, even though it's so much more than that. But what's going to be the issue in 20 years that's going to draw in Asian Americans? And I'm not sure exactly when, but at some point Asian Americans will be the largest minority group in the country. So what new challenges and things will that bring up? What new things will we start talking about when it's now a quote majority minority country? Yeah.
I'm interested in your discussion of the word racism and the word racist,
Yeah.
Because I've noticed this, similar to what you said in your talk, this sort of trend towards like trying to use the label racist and then it sort of ends the conversation. And something similar occurring, perhaps not analogous, with the word feminist, where there'll be all these like interviews with famous women and they'll ask the gotcha question of like, are you a feminist or are you not? And then the conversation kind of just gets derailed from there. And it's all about this label and not necessarily about substantive things that might fall under this label. So I'm wondering how you as a reporter sort of navigate the stickiness of labels versus substantive thing that can maybe denote sometimes.
Yeah, well, you can look at it a couple ways. Like one, when I'm trying to go out and cover something, an issue of race, I always want to look at what is actually happening in people's lives or in a certain situation. What is a cause? What is an effect? How is something affecting people? I think that there is an importance to call out something as racist when it is racist, when it does fit that mold, to aggressively say it. Like if you look at, for instance, the coverage in the New York Times now with the new era that we're in terms of the presidency, we're moving more towards saying in the paper explicitly, this is not true, So do we call something a racist policy, or do we call it racially tinged, or something like that? So I think the most important thing is to make sure readers and people understand what is going on, like what is kind of at work in whatever topic we're covering. The label can be important, but I personally don't like to necessarily harp on it per se, but I also think it's important to not to ignore the label, because like what I was saying here is about confronting racism and the only way we confront race in this country is if we can talk about racism, if we can say the word, it's a bad word, to say racist or racism. So I think as long as I consider the job to be pretty well done if I'm able to convey like what is actually going on. And if the label somehow needs to play into that, then yeah, I think we should absolutely not shy away from it. But I don't think it always has to be there.
When you were in, I think you said Lawrence, Kansas? on the
Paola, Kansas, yeah.
So you're on the job, you're on the streets, and they pulled you over. What was your reaction, and then what was their reaction when you told them you were committing crimes?
So I'll give you the story. So I'm in the campground interviewing, and I had a photographer. He was a white guy with beard and stuff. And I was kind of going up, and he was usually hanging back. And if someone wanted to talk, then he'd say, hey, "Can you take pictures?" And so, we kind of left the campground. We started driving, and he saw like a tractor or something driving down the middle. So he pulled off into the shoulder, and he got out and started snapping pictures. And the cop car pulled up behind. I didn't even see the cop. And then the cop goes and asks him for his ID. Then he comes up and asks me, and I'm like, why do I have to show you my ID? I'm not driving. He goes, "Sir, we got a report of a suspicious person. I'm allowed to ask for your ID or whatever." And I told him for the, and he didn't care. Like it was, it didn't matter to him at all.
Told me New York Times report.
Yeah, I said we're out here for the New York Times, working on a story, and he didn't care. Yeah, so they just kind of, look and I'm one who, there's Wesley Lowery from the Washington Post. He got arrested in Ferguson, as many people know, in this McDonald's, because they were telling him to leave, and they don't, leave quickly enough apparently. I'm very torn. I'm one who, I'm not going to be in handcuffs. So like, as much as I wanted to say, screw you, I'm not showing you my ID. I also didn't want to like get arrested, and I don't want to go through all that. So I showed him the ID, but I did ask him, and he just kind of said, I'm allowed to ask for it. And when it happened in Lincoln, Nebraska, the cops, they were young guys, and they were a little bit younger, and they were like, "Oh, you probably hate our city now," or something like that. They kind of tried to joke about it a little bit. So in that case, I don't necessarily blame the cops per se, but whoever's calling suspicious people, it's like, knocking on doors. Like now, I don't know if it's a larger commentary about our society and like that we don't like trust each other anymore. Because knocking on doors, isn't that what you have a doorbell for? So people go and knock on the door, and I certainly wasn't looking into windows, and I had a notepad in my hand. Told you what I was wearing, it's yeah. So yeah.
Do people ever try to question or challenge the objectivity of your reporting because you are a black reporter and you're reporting on race, and how do you deal with that?
Yeah, I think there are definitely instances where people, when I come out and I'm talking to them about something, they assume that I already have a side. I'm sure, again, this existential question I was talking about, is it because I'm black, or is it because I'm with the New York Times, which is, this liberal, rag of a paper. So it's kind of hard to tell sometimes. What I tell them, and this is the truth, I was talking to Tracy's class earlier today, but for me, I really come in with an open mind, and even if, and as I was saying, I think one of the things we need to do is, even if we don't agree with someone's point and maybe find a little bit reprehensible, I think that we should still be open to having a conversation with them, especially when you find people who are at least open to hearing you out and open to hearing different views. So I kind of just tell them the truth that, listen, like, I am honestly coming in here without any bias. I want to learn your side. Like, I didn't drive 3 hours across the state of Kansas to come and just assume something that I could have done from my bedroom. So I kind of let them know that, hey, and this is me. This is what I want. I want to give you a voice, and I think that's the most important thing that we do as journalists, whether it be someone who's in a marginalized community, whether it be someone who's a white supremacist in North Dakota or something like that. Let's figure out what's going on here.
Do you ever draw the line? Is there sort of a certain point at which you're not trying to hear someone out?
It hasn't happened yet, and I will only know when it gets there. I remember one time I was in. This is not necessarily race related, but one time I was in Nebraska, and it was something about there was a rally against gay marriage or something like that. It was in Iowa. Excuse me, it was in Iowa because they had passed. I think there's Iowa State Supreme Court had passed gay marriage, and someone had brought up the argument that I'd heard many times, like on blogs or like on TV. But like the thing about well, when are people gonna start marrying animals and stuff? And I just remember I was like people actually said that. Like people actually make that argument. So it didn't draw a line per se, but I was very like, this is different, So. Anything else?
Thank you, John.
Thank you all.